Thank you for coming today, everyone. Today's in-depth training class, we're going to be talking about selection lists and how dependent lists can be used to make entering orders easier. In the system, we have a couple different types of selection lists. We have what's called a dynamic linked list, and we have a dependent list. The way that these lists work is they work a little bit together. A dynamic linked list is a list that looks at all the parts within a given category and will show all the parts from that category for you without you having to modify the list every time a new part gets entered. Using these particular lists, you can link it to a category, and that way anytime that you add a new type of material, anytime you make a material inactive, the list will automatically update to reflect the parts that are in that particular category, so you no longer have to modify the list every time you make a change to your parts within the system. What also happens is we have the dependent list, and that is a list that is essentially linked to another list. So I will have a item on one list, and when I select that item, that tells that item to pull down a second selection list that pulls from another set of lists. So that way I can have multiple different lists linked to one list, so that way when I pick one item, it will fill in the next list with another set of items. If I pick a second item, then that will fill in that same list with a completely new set of items. And we will go through an example of how you can set that up and how that looks within the system. So within Control, if I go to Setup, Pricing Setup, All Pricing Setup, we've created a part category for this particular call. If I go under Part Setup, Materials, Roll and Flats, and then Flat Stock Materials. We've created a category under here for cork that has not been linked up. We haven't done any lists for it yet. So I have these parts within the system that the system does not know they exist yet because we haven't added them to any of our selection lists. So what we're going to do is we're going to create the dynamic list that links to this category, and then we'll apply this list to the drop-down list for my flat stock materials, so that way whenever I select the selection list for my corks, all those parts will get filled in automatically. So to get to the selection list, we're going to go to Setup, Pricing Setup, All Pricing Setup. On the left side, under the supporting components, there is selection lists. Under selection lists, this is where all the different selection lists within the system are found, and they are all broken down within the different categories that they exist in. So we have selection lists for cut vinyls, we have selection lists for roll materials, for our printers. Every single item within the system has its own list. Since we're going to be looking at doing a sheet of cork, which is a flat stock material, we're going to look under the category here for flat stock. So under flat stock, I have a secondary section for flat stock substrates. If I expand that list, I see all the different lists that are in the system already for the flat stocks. The way that all these lists are, these are all dynamic lists except for the main list for flat stock material types. So if I click on the acrylic types here, I'll see that this is using a dynamic link to acrylic. I click on Coroplast, dynamic link to Coroplast. So all the type lists are the dynamic lists that the system uses to link to the different part categories, so that way those lists update automatically. Then the top level list, which is the flat stock material types, is the list that contains all those different lists. This would be our main list, and then as you can see here, I have my acrylic listed here, and then material list, which is our dependent list. So whenever I select acrylic, the list that gets pulled in on the next section is going to be the acrylic types. If I select Coroplast, the list that gets pulled in is Coroplast types. So using this option, I can make it so that way whenever I select an option on the first list, on the flat stock material type list, a secondary list gets filled in with whatever dependent list I link to that particular selection. So for us to go ahead and create the cork on this list here, the first thing that we want to do is create the dynamic list that goes with that. So I'm going to click on the category for flat stock substrates, and then click on New List. First thing is we just give this list a name, call it Cork Types, and then from here we can add our dynamic link. That is done through the arrow button next to Insert Row. So if I pull this drop down here, I got Insert Row, and then I have Add Dynamic Part Category. So if I click this option here, it brings up all the different categories within the system. So I can either scroll down through the list if I'm looking for a specific item, or I can also type in the category name if I know the name of the category. So I select Cork, click OK, and that adds the link to this list. There's one final thing that needs to be done on this list for it to work correctly, and that is the box under the default line that says Use Parent Default FX. This box needs to be checked because this is what the system uses to determine how much of this material to use. So we're telling it to use its parent consumption by checking this box. So we'll save that, and that gives us our new dynamic list. So from here, I can click on the list for Fosstock material types and edit this list. From here, I can insert a new row, and the first column is the text column. From here, I can put whatever it is I want to type into here. So I can just type in Cork because that's what I want to be able to select. And then from here, under the material list is where we link it up to the list that we just created. I can either start typing in the list name if I remember the list that was created, or if I need to go searching for a list, I can click on the ellipse in that same column and then drill down through the same options that I have over here on the main selection list field. And select that list. So now what I have done is I've linked this list to the Cork selection, so whenever I pick Cork on this first list, the secondary list or the dependent list that pulls from it will use my Cork type list. So from here I go ahead and save this, and it's going to give me a warning. That warning just says that the line that is blank on the selection list is more important than the line that actually says blank. So we can click OK to continue here. And one thing that you can also do with a selection list is you're not limited to the number of dynamic links that you use. So from here, I can also go to Fosstock Substrates, and I'm going to do a new list. So maybe I want to have multiple different categories kind of rolled up into one list just because I want to use a generic list. So I can just say, in this case, I'm going to name my list Fosstock Types, and I'm just going to add in a couple of different dynamic links. So I'll add in a link for acrylic, and just keep pulling that option down and just keep adding multiple different dynamic links. And we'll add 3. And we'll save that and go back to our original list. Insert another row. And we'll just add in a new row that links to that particular list instead. From here, let's go ahead and run through an example of an order to take a look at how this particular list pulls in some information. So if I do new order, go to items, we're going to go to digital prints, and do rigid sign print. From here, the lists that we all changed were related to the Fosstock material types. So if I pull down the material type list, I'll see all those items are reflected within the list here. So there's my acrylic, my aluminum, and the items that we added at the very bottom, the cork and the common materials. If I select cork, what happens is the second list, the material list, will fill in with the parts that are under that category, because that's the dependent list that gets pulled in on this secondary list right here. If I go back and I select the common materials and then go up to the material list, I have all the different categories that I had pulled in whenever I created that particular dynamic list there. So using these features, you can tailor multiple different lists and have your particular products pull in the list of materials that you want it to be pulled in. And that is an introduction to how you can use the dependent lists and the selections within the system. Next week's call, we'll be talking about how you can modify the variables and actually use multiple different lists and how you can link up the different variables that way. Thank you, and please join us next week.